Hey, how are you? It's Barry Hawkins, and welcome to another episode of Barry Hawkins Live. What are we going to talk about tonight? Well, unshockingly, we continue in our theme on team level development process, specifically focusing right now on the events that go into an effective development cycle. Scrum calls them sprints. Other flavors of batch development process don't call them that. And in batch development processes, there's one meeting that, to me, they all have their specific purpose and impact, but few of the meetings determine how the next cycle is going to go to the same degree that backlog grooming does. So tonight, we are looking at effective backlog grooming. We'll be going over some tips and guidance, things to consider or experiment with if you're experiencing challenges with backlog grooming, what you can do about those, what you can do with those, and then we'll get into Q&A. So let's get going. First of all, backlog grooming, what is it meant to be? How is it meant to be structured? Who should be there? The intent with backlog grooming is that you should have the whole team together. And the intended outcome of effective backlog grooming is that you leave that time together with the entire team feeling set up for success in the next development cycle, in the upcoming development cycle. You're looking at the most likely batch of work you're going to pull in next, ensuring that you're all in agreement around what that is, having good discussion around how you think roughly you intend to approach it. And once you have that, then the board is set for the next cycle. So the first key practice in effective backlog grooming is set your regular recurring backlog grooming to be 2 to 3 days before the end of the current cycle. Don't save backlog grooming until the last day of your current development cycle, because what you'll find is as you come into backlog grooming and you're having conversations around what do we think is going to be in this next sprint, sometimes you find surprises. Because there's what we thought was going to go into the next development cycle, but then things happen. Executive leadership changes their mind. There are live issues. There's a forum thread that's on fire, and you need to be able to respond to that. Any number of things can significantly alter the priority of what's in your development queue or team backlog. And if you're having backlog grooming 2 to 3 business days, 2 to 3 days before the end of your current cycle, well, now if you hit some of those surprises, you have time to do something about it. With 2 to 3 days left before you need to start the next cycle, you can go and have clarifying conversations. You can ensure things like, has the priority really shifted? Or is this something that can wait until the following cycle when we have a little more time to think through how we want to approach this? Or in fact, has it truly shifted? Because if it has truly shifted, well, then now during the next 2 to 3 days, you can budget time, set aside time to say, all right, let's swarm on this, talk through what this needs to be, how we can approach it based on the information we know, and enter the next cycle with the most information you can have given the circumstances. So 2 to 3 days before the end of the current cycle. Additionally, during backlog grooming, I encourage you to only focus on the top of the backlog, the top of your queue. And when I say top, I mean whatever your velocity or throughput is. So let's say that you've got a velocity of 40 story points. Your team over the last 6 cycles has averaged the completion of 40 story points in a development cycle or sprint. Well, in that case, when you come into backlog grooming, you should only be looking at the top 80 story points. So twice your velocity, the top 80 story points in your overall backlog. Because the thing is, the point of backlog grooming is to ensure, are we set up for success in the upcoming development cycle? So to that end, if you focus on that top 2 times your velocity, even if there's some churn and, jitter in your backlog and things are jostling around, shaking around, if you've looked at the top 2 times your velocity, there's a pretty good likelihood that for a lot of the shift that may have happened, you're still prepared. You're still okay and able to respond to those shifts and still end up with an effective cycle planning, sprint planning when you enter that next cycle a few days later. Additionally, if you go beyond 2 times the story, 2 times the amount of story points in your velocity. So let's say your velocity is 40. So instead of looking at the top 80, you start dipping down below into the 120, 160 points down. Well, the thing is, because with backlog grooming, you're trying to set yourself up for success for the next sprint or development cycle. If you go that far down, it's not that likely that the things that far down are going to suddenly leap up to the top of your queue, certainly not on any regular basis. So you're spending time discussing and preparing for things that are a ways off, when again, they're only 2 to 3 days before the next cycle starts. So ensuring that you're focusing on the most likely items in your queue to enter your next cycle, that's part of setting you up for success. Now, when we are looking at the items in our backlog, user stories or just outcomes, remember, not every outcome in your backlog has to be a user story. There's very little value in expressing something that's just a thing that needs to be done as a story, right? As a member of the development team, I can upgrade to the latest approved Java runtime environment so that I'm compliant with the company policies. The outcome is that you just need to upgrade the version of the JRE that you're running on, but taking the time to craft that into a story, not a lot of payoff. So just simply having an outcome that is update to current approved JRE, that's enough. That's good. Let's call it a day. That's the outcome. We know who it's for. We know why we care about it. We don't need to Play-Doh fun factory it into the as a user I can so that. So when you're looking at those outcomes, you want to ensure clarity, agreement, and alignment in the team on what the outcome is. What is going to be true when we finish this work that was not true before? You want to ensure that the team is clear on who it's for. Now there you may say, well, it's for a user, our users, because all of our user stories start with as a user. If all of your user stories start with as a user, that's a smell. The user clause should tell you exactly who it's for. Are these for account holders? Are these for anonymous visitors that have been driven to this part of the site via the work of our paid media team? Who is it? Who in your user base? What state are they in? Ensuring that people are clear on that. I'm resisting the urge because we will have sessions on user stories once we get past the events. But right now we're focusing on the events and backlog grooming. So who it's for specifically, why the outcome matters to them. That is what makes this outcome a compelling one to enable for those particular users in that particular state. You're also wanting, so are we clear on the story, basically, in a nutshell? Are we clear and aligned on the level of effort? Do we all agree that it's 3, 5, or 8 story points? Or is there disagreement? Do some of the engineers on the team feel like it's a 3, but some of the QA members of the team feel like it's an 8 or a 13? Let's have a conversation about that because we want to exit backlog grooming having come to alignment on what we think that level of effort is. And we also want to have a high level or general discussion around how we intend to approach the work. Not tasking it out, let's break out tasks and we create the same 3 tasks for every story we have. If you're creating the same 3 tasks for every story you have, you're not having critical thinking and good conversation around how you're approaching implementing that work. So ensuring clarity, having those conversations cross-functionally. See what the UX team member has to offer. See what the front-end and back-end engineers are saying. See what QA has to say about what it's going to take to accomplish this. All of the, game design, the infosec, compliance, depending on the kind of work you do, you have different skills in your team, and ensure that you're hearing from all of them, because you'd be surprised how one of those other disciplines sharing their input leads to shaking loose some understanding or the realization of some context by a member, another cross-functional member of the team. I'll also say, when I mentioned, don't be tasking it out, avoid premature tasking or assignment. There's a temptation for some teams to, in backlog grooming, to already start the sprint planning, to already start creating tasks and saying like, well, Terry will do this and Janet will do this. That is the whole intent of sprint planning, being able to task out, have discussions about the tasking out, assigning who's actually here, because, if you do backlog grooming and assign everyone out and make the tasks, well, sometimes you have somebody who ends up being out sick, or they had a family emergency, suddenly had to go out of town, and now the whole plan that you set up has left the building. Let's see. So resist that urge to, task and assign early. Embrace that agile and lean principle, XP principle of deferring decision until the last responsible moment. And for tasking and assignment, or not even, assignment, by the way, isn't even necessarily in sprint planning, but defer that decision until the last responsible moment, because at the last responsible moment, you're going to have the most information to inform that decision. Now, lastly, 50 minutes or less. I coach teams, and I believe it was Mike Cohn who first recommended this to me. The backlog grooming, cap it at 50 minutes. One, if you're booking 1 hour minutes, then you've probably got 1 hour meetings, then you probably have a meeting culture where people are constantly late to the next meeting because you're, artificially butting up meetings as if people could teleport from one to the other. You can't even get off Zoom that quick and logged into the next one. But most importantly, 50 minutes or less, because having good conversations, having good, active, engaged, cross-functional conversations when you're discussing work, when you're looking at these outcomes, what is the outcome? Let's get clear. Who is it for specifically? Why does it matter to them? What are the acceptance criteria? What is the definition of done here? Doing that work, having those discussions and being really engaged, that is, it's emotionally draining. It takes interpersonal and emotional energy to engage in that way and to ask clarifying questions of your other teammates. And there's something about when you get past that 50-minute mark, you can see the productivity and the energy tank, because people are spent. They start leaning back, or they're on their phone, or the laptop pops open. Don't try to go longer than that, because it's you may think you're getting through more, but you're actually, truth be told, you're not, because you're not getting the engagement and the energy that you need to have the discussions and the alignment that you're going for. So those are today's guidance. As you might imagine, backlog grooming is a huge topic. I spend a lot of time with teams on this when I'm coaching, consulting, or mentoring teams internally. So let's look at our questions. And John Mayer has a question for us today. How do you handle spike stories, research, or we have no idea of level of effort? Love this question. Research and spike stories. I typically assign a chunky story point value to spike stories or research, because it's you want to budget enough time to actually do research and experimentation, but you also want to time box yourself enough not to spin out into analysis paralysis, and just spin your wheels. So I typically, I should also say that for me, the top, especially when you're looking at the top 2 times your velocity in your backlog, there's a distribution of story point ranges, and I find that there's a distribution that you want to shoot for in the top 2 sprints worth of your backlog, and then a distribution you want to shoot for in all of the work that's farther out than that. In the top 2, top 2 cycles worth or sprints worth of stories, you're looking for a bell curve that really goes between the 1 and 13 range. So, the Fibonacci story point card sequence 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, 100. You want those top 2 velocities worth of stories at the top of the queue. Those should range between 1 and 13, and they really should distribute just like a bell curve would. They should mostly distribute highly within the 3 to 8 range, so 3, 5, 8. And so when you're looking at spike stories, research stories, I typically go for a 13 or a 20 point because it needs to be big enough. This isn't something that, people are knocking out their work on it in a day or 2. It typically also involves more than one person involved in the spike. So I typically do 13 or 20 points, but also for me, 13 or 20 points, it's enough time to experiment, but also not so long that people go the whole sprint without really checking in or come to a decision. And might the research require more than one spike in that way? Absolutely. However, if you're chunking your research or your spikes that small, you're forcing yourself to evaluate at more regular intervals instead of having this research spike that carries over for 3 sprints and people still can't tell you what the conclusion was. Spike it, point spike stories large enough to actually experiment, but short enough to time box yourselves so that you make, incremental decisions that inform then the next research spike or, help you discover whether or not that was okay, cool. That was enough. We actually know our direction. All right. So then what else do we have? Let's see. What if I can't get people to participate? Well, not unlike so many of the other events of effective development process, there are folks who are less inclined to participate and chime in. And this is where having some degree of a facilitation toolkit for yourself, how to draw people into conversation, how to maybe dampen the participation from some members who tend to over contribute and dominate the conversation. I will often ask if I have some more reluctant participants or team members. I will, if we're talking about a given story and I'm not hearing from them, and I know I should be, to say, Jennifer, this sounds a lot like that story 2 or 3 sprints ago where we thought it was only this big, but then what you uncovered is we had tasked it out as if it was just the implementation, not also writing the unit and integration tests and documentation. Is this like that? You're just ask questions that are somewhere between not just yes, no, but not so open-ended that it feels like you're trying to manipulate them. Because you're not trying to manipulate them, you're just trying to make them feel safe and bring them in and reinforce to them that your input is valuable here. You sharing your perspective and insight helps us have a more informed understanding of this outcome, what it's going to take to implement it, and how we can best commit to the next batch of work. Facilitating, trying to draw people in, make them feel valued, reinforce and underscore for them that they are valued on the team. Let's see next. What if people don't want to attend backlog grooming because I only need them for a couple of things? Okay, this is great. There are some people on your team, and sometimes there are some people who, maybe they're mapped to your team, but they're not fully there, like you only have, 6 to 15 hours, taskable hours of them every sprint, because they're mapped across multiple teams or something. If you have that kind of situation, or if you have a subject matter expert who needs to be able to answer clarifying questions around acceptance criteria, front load or back load the stories and items where you need their input, and group those together so that, like, let's say, group it toward I most often group it toward the front, because then they can show up. You're going to focus on those things that need them, get through them and say, thank you so much. Feel free to hang around. But if you need to go too, that's also fine, because now you're respecting their time, and you're not placing on them the burden of, I expect you to sit here if and when we eventually get to something where we need your input. Instead, you're saying, no, we're moving that stuff forward to ensure that we get the critical information and input we need from you, but also respecting the fact that you don't need to sit here and listen to things that don't involve you. One nice little surprise there is sometimes when they feel respected and seen in that way, they'll say like, oh, I'll just hang around. And then it turns out they actually had valuable input on some of the stuff you didn't think they would be involved in. So that's a cool thing to look out for. Let's see here. John with another. Thoughts on including QA for backlog grooming? Absolutely, yes, sir. When I say that the intended format and structure of backlog grooming is the team together, I mean the whole cross-functional team. Your different engineering disciplines, QA, UX. If it's a game team, the game design, the different especially in game development, you typically have multiple very specific engineering disciplines. Having them there, if it's an art skewed team, not just the artists, the tech artists, have all the different other skills that the concept artists, have them there, because you want the holistic cross-functional input when you're looking at, are we locked and loaded for the next cycle? Do we understand the work and the input we need from each cross-functional discipline? I tell teams, and I tell people, and people are on teams, so I could have said just one thing there, but each cross-functional discipline brings a unique facet of perspective to the work that you're trying to do. The way that a given engineering discipline looks at an outcome you're trying to accomplish is not the same as how a member of the QA team looks at it. It's also not the same as how a member of the UX team looks at it. They each there's a reason that their skill set is on the team, and you want to ensure that all of those facets are brought together, because it's when you have the facets together interacting and engaged with one another, that's when you have the most holistic perspective and the least naive context informing your commitments and your approach to doing the work. So yes, thank you, John. QA and everybody else in the backlog grooming. Let's see here. What do you do if the team doesn't seem aligned on outcome, level of effort, and approach? Okay, now this happens, right? You'll get into backlog grooming. You think you're okay, then you're going through. You're like 4 stories in. You get to one, and there's complete disagreement. Like everyone thought they understood one another, but when you're going through it again, they're all over the map. I recommend one. Keep an eye on the tension, because this, again, you're looking at what are we set up to be able to commit to and execute a batch of work and do everything we thought we could do next cycle. If they see something that's supposed to be in the locked and loaded, portion of your backlog, and suddenly they realize they're not on the same page, there can just be a sudden influx of anxiety and tension in the room. And when anxiety and tension and then fear enter the room, well, now you have people who feel like they're on a precipice. They're like, oh, this is a crisis. And if you don't help everyone stay focused and feel safe and comfortable with the uncertainty, then it can spiral into interpersonal conflict and accusation and just non-productive conflict. So be quick to acknowledge, okay, cool, it's clear we're learning how far off we are on having this nailed down. Let's maybe let's do planning poker. Let's do some planning poker on this one. Have the highest person say why they think it's so high, the lowest person say why they think it's so low. Have a few rounds of that. See if that helps tease loose, shake loose some understanding. You can also ask the question, if you try to facilitate a bit of dialogue and see if we can get to a better point, and it's just not happening. Let's ask the question of ourselves, should this not be in the next sprint? Should this not be in the next development cycle? And it needs to be okay to say no. If you all have a responsible, frank, accountable conversation and feel like this would be unwise to pull into the next cycle until we can get more clarity, then move it down the backlog and be sure to follow up with the stakeholder or customer or dependent team who has that story and just say, and let them know, hey, look, we thought we were going to get this into the next cycle. Looking at it today, it's clear that we need to spend more time clarifying the problem, defining the problem, what it is we're trying to solve for you. So we're committed to getting time with you over the next 2 weeks to get that clarified, but it does mean it's going to come a bit later. But we would rather spend some more time and get you the thing you're actually looking for than have you expecting something that ends up either being way later or, even worse, not what you expected, not what you were looking for. Let's see here. Okay. Looks like, all right, this will probably be the last one. As someone leading a backlog grooming session, I have a lot of ground to cover. Why would I only go for 50 minutes? You would only go for 50 minutes, which we touched on earlier, because getting people to say, fine, yeah, call it a 13, fine, call it a 2 or a 3, when they're clearly not engaged and aligned, you're getting farther down your backlog, but not via engagement and buy-in. It's by trying to drive people to acquiesce to progress. When we do that, we're pursuing action instead of effectiveness. We're not really doing what we're there to do in backlog grooming and in backlog maintenance, which we'll be talking about in the next upcoming episode. We're trying to have engaged, effective conversations around the outcomes, who they're for, why they matter. Increasingly refining what the acceptance criteria are as stories that are way down our backlog make their way up and get closer to implementation time. And we're also, as a team, working to normalize and better understand one another and become more cohesive as a team, because over time, not only are we coming to understand our own work and being able to articulate our own work as a member of a cross-functional team better, we're also coming to understand what the other cross-functional disciplines have to do and how they approach their work. And understanding their craft helps us better inform how we bring our crafts together and be as effective as we can be at doing development work together. So that's backlog grooming. I hope that, feel free, if you're watching the replay, do feel free to put your questions in the comments below. Happy to answer those, and sometimes those even inform and can be some of the content in follow-up episodes. And for if you're new here, or if you've been watching and haven't done so yet, please like and subscribe and share at work on LinkedIn, Facebook, with your friends, Twitter, you name it. Get the word out there, because the more people we have coming, the more questions we get, the more it helps me shake things loose out of this old brain to share with you. So as always, thanks for tuning in. Be well, and I wish you the most effective development process and healthy teams you can possibly have. Take care.